In the spring of 1962, a record arrived in American music that nobody had been expecting and that nobody, in retrospect, should have been surprised by. Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music was an album by Ray Charles, a black artist from Georgia who had invented soul music, who had fused gospel and rhythm and blues in ways that had changed what American popular music was capable of doing, who had spent a decade establishing himself as one of the most significant voices in a genre that was explicitly, structurally associated with Black American experience. He recorded an album of country music. He recorded it with full orchestral arrangements. He recorded it without apology or explanation or any of the contextual framing that might have made the decision easier for an industry to categorize and digest. He simply made it, and it became the best-selling album of his career to that point. It spent 14 weeks at #1 on the pop album charts. It introduced a generation of country music listeners to Ray Charles and a generation of Ray Charles listeners to country music. It demolished, in a single release, a set of assumptions about genre and race and artistic identity that the American music industry had been building for decades. But the story of that album, the real story, the story that the chart positions and the sales figures do not tell, begins much earlier than 1962. It begins in a place that no one who wrote about the album's commercial triumph thought to look. In the red clay roads of rural Georgia and Florida, in the specific sounds of Ray Charles's earliest years, in the music that was in the air of the American South before he had any way to know that what he was absorbing would become, 30 years later, the foundation of the most unlikely artistic decision of his career, and it begins with a conversation, a single direct, difficult conversation with the people at ABC-Paramount Records who did not want him to make the album at all. Tupar onania ahadalbuis hayarde. Ray Charles grew up in Greenville, Florida, in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The musical landscape of that place and time was not segregated in the way that the music industry would later become. Sound did not respect the boundaries that the social order was attempting to maintain. Gospel came through church windows on Sunday mornings. Blues came through the walls of juke joints on Saturday nights, and from the radio that sat in the corner of almost every house in rural Florida regardless of the race or income of the family inside, came country music. Hank Williams, Jimmy Rogers, the Carter family, the voices of the Grand Ole Opry carried across the American South to anyone with a radio and a willingness to listen, and Ray Charles, whose willingness to listen was total, who absorbed sound the way other people absorb light, who was building his entire understanding of the world through his ears in the years before, and after he lost his sight. Listened to all of it. He listened without the category of country music yet fully formed in his mind. He listened to it as sound, as feeling, as the specific emotional content of voices singing about things that happen to people, love and loss, and the particular texture of ordinary life lived in difficult circumstances. He has spoken about this in interviews over the decades with a directness that often surprised the people asking. They expected him to describe country music as something he had encountered later, as a genre he had approached from the outside as an artistic project or a commercial calculation. Instead, he described it as something he had grown up with, as part of the sonic landscape of his childhood, as music that had entered him before he had the category of country music to put it in, before he knew that this music was supposed to belong to someone other than him, before the music industry had told him, implicitly and then explicitly, what kind of music a black artist from Georgia was supposed to make. The emotional terrain of country music, the specific quality of longing and loss, and the documentation of ordinary human experience that characterizes its best recordings, was not unfamiliar to Ray Charles. It was, in fact, the same emotional terrain he had always been crossing. The longing in Hank Williams was the same longing as the longing in the gospel music Ray had learned in the church and in the rhythm and blues he had been making for a decade. Different surface, same depth. Different vocabulary, same feeling underneath the vocabulary. Different names for the same human need to say something that pure speech cannot adequately contain. He heard it. He had always heard it. He simply had not, until 1962, found the right moment to play it to part TW. Commerce at ABC-Paramount. The meeting happened in a conference room at ABC-Paramount Records in New York City. Ray Charles was present. His manager and his lawyer were present. Several executives from the label were present, including people responsible for the commercial direction of his career. Ray Charles had come to the meeting with a specific proposal. He wanted to record an album of country and Western music, arranged with full orchestra sung in his voice, produced under his creative control. He had the master ownership clause in his contract, the specific provision he had negotiated into his ABC-Paramount deal that gave him the right to own the recordings he made. He was not asking for permission. He was informing the label of his intention and giving them the professional courtesy of a conversation before he proceeded. The response from the label executives was not enthusiastic. The objections came in various forms. The commercial argument country music listeners were not Ray Charles's audience, and Ray Charles's audience was not the country music market. A record that fell between the two would satisfy neither. The racial argument, stated more carefully but present nonetheless, a black artist recording country music would face resistance in both markets, from country music listeners who identified the genre with a specific cultural tradition that did not include Ray Charles, and from Ray Charles's existing audience who might perceive the move as a departure from the music they had come to expect from him. The artistic argument. Ray Charles had spent a decade building a sound, an identity, a reputation for a specific kind of music. Departing from it was a risk that the commercial logic of the record industry did not easily support. Ray Charles listened to all of these arguments with the complete, characteristic attention he brought to everything. He did not interrupt. He did not argue while the executives were making their points. He waited until they had finished. Then he said something that the people who were present in that room have described in subsequent years as the moment the conversation changed. He said, "I grew up hearing this music. It belongs to me as much as it belongs to anyone." Not as an argument about cultural politics or racial equity in the music industry, though it was also that. As a simple statement of fact. He had heard this music, it was inside him, he was going to make it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the executives asked what kind of arrangements he was envisioning. Ray Charles began describing the orchestral sound he had in mind, the strings, the brass, the specific way the country material would be framed in a sonic environment that drew on the full range of his musical vocabulary. The conversation shifted, slowly, from resistance to logistics. Not because the executives had been fully persuaded, because Ray Charles had made clear, without aggression and without performance, that this was not a negotiation about whether, it was a conversation about how. deneme, the recording sessions for modern sounds in country and Western music began in late 1961 and continued into early 1962. Ray Charles brought to the sessions the same qualities he brought to everything he recorded: complete preparation, total engagement with the material, an expectation of precision from everyone in the room, and the willingness to do as many takes as necessary to get what he was hearing in his head onto the tape. He chose the songs himself. This was not a project in which a committee had assembled a playlist of country standards for a famous artist to interpret. Ray Charles had been thinking about this material for years, had been hearing it since childhood, had been considering its emotional content with the same analytical intelligence he applied to everything that interested him musically. He brought a list to the first session that he had built over months of listening, returning to recordings, weighing one song against another with the same deliberate care he brought to every significant decision in his professional life. The songs he chose were not chosen for commercial calculation. They were chosen because they said something he wanted to say, because they contained emotional content that he recognized from the inside. I Can't Stop Loving You, a song about a love that cannot be released, about the persistence of feeling beyond the logical end of its occasion. You Don't Know Me, a song about being misunderstood by someone you love, about the gap between what is felt and what is communicated, the specific pain of being fully present to someone who cannot fully see you. Born to Lose, a song about the specific fatalism of someone who has always expected loss and has stopped being surprised by its arrival. Hey Good Lookin', Bye Bye Love, half as much. Each one a document of a specific kind of human experience. The ordinary, the universal, the particular texture of living and losing and continuing regardless. Each of these songs, in its original country version, was exactly that, a document. Ray Charles's recordings of them were not covers in the conventional sense, not faithful reproductions of a source material, not tributes to the originals. They were re-inhabited from the inside. Ray Charles brought to each song the specific emotional content of his own life, the losses he had actually sustained, the loves he had actually felt and failed to communicate, the fatalism he had earned through his own specific experience of the world. He was not interpreting country music from the outside. He was recognizing himself in it from within. The orchestral arrangements were elaborate and precise, full string sections, brass, the kind of production scale that had been associated with pop music rather than with either country or rhythm and blues. Ray Charles used the orchestral sound not to make the country material more accessible or more commercially palatable, but to give it the scope it deserved, to say, through the size of the sound, that the emotional content of these songs was large enough to warrant this much sonic space. The strings were not decoration. They were the full expression of what the songs were carrying. The sessions were, by the accounts of the musicians who participated in them, among the most focused and demanding recording environments they had experienced. Ray Charles knew what he wanted. He could hear the gap between what was being played and what the music required, and he was not willing to accept the gap as an approximation. He pushed until the gap closed. A wrong note in the string section, a phrasing that was slightly off the emotional mark, he heard it, he stopped, he corrected it. Every musician in those sessions left understanding something, about the relationship between technical precision and emotional truth that they had not fully understood before they walked in. Two parts Onana and Das Relas, Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music was released in April 1962. The reaction was immediate and in important ways, unlike anything that had happened to a Ray Charles record before. The country music establishment did not know what to do with it. The record was clearly not country in any conventional sense. The orchestral arrangements, the production scale, the specific quality of Ray Charles's voice were all foreign to the genre's existing conventions, but the emotional content was undeniably there. The songs were country songs, treated with a seriousness and a depth that country music's own most dedicated listeners recognized as genuine. The pop music establishment did not know what to do with it either. It was Ray Charles, whose identity as a soul and R&B artist was firmly established, but it sounded like nothing in those genres, the orchestral scale, the song choices, the specific emotional register. All of it was different from what a Ray Charles record was supposed to be. The audience, it turned out, did not share the industry's confusion. They simply responded to the music. I Can't Stop Loving You reached #1 on both the pop and R&B charts. A single that crossed every boundary the music industry had erected, that reached listeners who had not previously listened to Ray Charles and listeners who had never listened to country music and listeners who had loved both for years and had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting for exactly this. The album spent 14 weeks at #1 on the pop album charts. It was certified gold. It remained on the charts for over 2 years. It sold to audiences that no one in the music industry had identified as a natural market for a Ray Charles country album. What had happened was simple, though it took the industry some time to understand it. Ray Charles had made a record that was emotionally true. Not true to a genre, not true to a demographic, not true to a commercial calculation. Emotionally true. True to the actual content of the songs, true to his own actual experience of the feelings those songs were about. True to the musical intelligence he had been developing since he was 9 years old in a practice room in St. Augustine. The audience heard the truth. They always do when it is genuinely present. PHFEAITEG, the significance of modern sounds in country and Western music extends beyond its sales figures and its chart positions, beyond the Grammy Award it won for Best Rhythm and Blues Recording, a categorization that itself revealed the industry's uncertainty about where to place it, its need to assign to a familiar box something that refused to fit neatly into any of the existing ones. Its significance is in what it demonstrated about the nature of musical genre and the nature of artistic identity. Ray Charles had been told implicitly and explicitly throughout his career what kind of artist he was. He was a black artist, he made black music. The categories were not simply descriptive. They were prescriptive, they established limits. They defined what was commercially expected and therefore what was artistically permitted. The music industry of the early 1960s operated on the assumption that genre was a natural organizing principle, that audiences were served by artists who stayed within their lanes, that crossing between genres was a risky departure from the logic of the market. Ray Charles did not accept this framework. He had never accepted it. The move from gospel to rhythm and blues that had produced his earliest breakthroughs had been its own form of border crossing, its own refusal of the category that said sacred music and secular music occupied different worlds. The move to country music was larger, more visible, more commercially audacious, but it came from the same place, the conviction that music was music, that emotional truth was not segregated by genre, and that his ear, which had been hearing across every boundary since childhood, which had never been taught to honor the divisions the industry was trying to maintain, was a more reliable guide than any convention about what Ray Charles was supposed to sound like. The artists who came after him, who crossed genre lines, who refused to stay in the categories assigned to them, who insisted on the full range of their musical intelligence rather than the portion that was commercially convenient, built on a foundation that modern sounds in country and Western music had helped establish. Not because Ray Charles had made a political argument about genre boundaries or a public statement about racial integration in American music, because he had simply made the music and let it speak for itself. Because truth, when it is genuinely present in a piece of music, does not require explanation or justification. It simply arrives, and the audience hears it. He had heard country music since he was 4 years old in Greenville, Florida. He had heard it as his music, not as someone else's tradition that he was borrowing, but as part of the sonic landscape that had formed him. He waited 30 years to record it. When he finally did, he recorded it with the full force of everything he had become in those 30 years. The voice, the intelligence, the emotional depth, the production ambition, the absolute conviction that what he was making was true. It was. And the world heard it. To Epilogu. The Radio Dranvile. There is a specific image that Ray Charles returned to, in various forms, when asked about modern sounds in country and Western music in the years after its release. He returned to it not in a sentimental way, not as a performed origin story, but in the direct, factual way he spoke about everything that had actually formed him. He returned to the radio. The radio in rural Greenville, Florida in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The radio that played everything, gospel, blues, jazz, and the voices of the Grand Ole Opry, Hank Williams and Jimmy Rogers carrying across the evening air to a small house, where a boy who was losing his sight was learning to hear more completely than anyone around him could understand. He said the music was all there, all of it, on the same radio. Nobody told it to stay separate. This is the whole story, contained in 2 sentences. The music did not know it was supposed to be segregated. The radio did not know it was supposed to play only certain kinds of sound to certain kinds of people. And the boy listening, the boy whose sight was failing and whose hearing was therefore becoming more complete, more total, more all-encompassing than any sighted person's hearing would ever need to be. That boy heard all of it, and held all of it, and carried all of it forward into the music he spent the rest of his life making. Modern sounds in country and Western music was not a crossover experiment. It was not a commercial gamble or an artistic provocation or a statement about racial integration in American music, though it was also all of those things. It was a boy from Greenville, Florida, finally playing what he had always heard. The radio in the corner. The voice of Hank Williams on a summer evening. The sound of a world that did not know it was supposed to be divided. Ray Charles had been listening to it for 30 years. When he finally played it back, the world recognized it immediately. Because the truth always sounds familiar, even when you have never heard it quite this way before.